At the time of this video, Smogan is embroiled in two controversial suspect tests. In the current generation of Scarlet and Violet, the community has pooled their forum likes together to retest Palafin. Yes, you did hear that right. Meanwhile, in the land of Generation 4, Machamp is on the chopping block for the widespread hatred for its no-guard dynamic punches, often assisted by paralysis. It's controversial both in itself and for the fact that it's being tested instead of Jirachi and its Serene Grace Iron Head. This inspired us to look back throughout history to examine some of the most controversial bans in Smogan's lengthy lifespan. The road to a more competitive metagame as democratically selected by the player base is quite rocky. Even if the results wind up being fruitful, you might arrive at a balanced metagame, but in order to do so, you might have to convince some people that yes, that crazy broken Pokemon like Galarian Darmanitan should in fact be banned. So join us in counting down the top 5 most controversial Smogan bans of all time. Nowadays, Baton Pass being broken is considered the most obvious thing in the world. It's so obvious, in fact, that Gen 3 players regularly have to argue for why it's not broken in their tier. And despite the strategy being limited about 1,000,000 times, it still manages to stir up controversy there. There was a lengthy period of time, though, where BP being busted and therefore banned was not something you could take for granted. In fact, it took years and years of certain players fighting tooth and nail to convince the public that there was a problem at all. What made the whole affair particularly bizarre was that BP was generally despised. We know it now for its unreliable, matchup-reliant nature, a playstyle you are not outmaneuvering anyone with. You pretty much live and die by the matchup. The problem arises because the options for dealing with BP are quite limited, so cheesing wins against otherwise well-built teams is quite feasible. It creates team-building difficulties throughout the matchup disparity it introduces into whichever tier it's in, and makes for non-interactive battles. And this isn't a new revelation. In the advanced era, this was all well known, and BP users were looked down upon. The community back then tended to value expression of skill, and there was no skill in winning with a playstyle that played itself. If you thought you could outplay your opponent, you wouldn't use BP, because the game wouldn't be in your control. It only existed for worse players to try and squeeze an auto-win against better ones. For this reason, there was a great stigma around BP that curtailed its usage in more serious battles. Basically, it was considered dishonorable. But why was it not addressed in tiering back then? Well, it was, in some smaller communities. The German player base instilled a 2 baton passer limit, for instance. However, back then, quote-unquote tiering as we know it now did not exist. It was basically a dictatorship, and if they didn't like it, players were encouraged to go play somewhere else. There were no suspect tests. What was Uber was very limited. Pretty much just the most extreme legendaries were Uber. There weren't even usage stats, with the OU-UU divide being decided like Uber's off the general feeling of the dictatorship. Then in Generation 4, the massive new players flooding in for the introduction of Wi-Fi play ushered in the democratic community suspect system still in place today. This increasingly larger community also meant the honor code holding back BP use in tournaments slowly dissolved until eventually nobody was being shamed for bringing it back to a big game. At least not to the point where it dissuaded them from bringing it in the first place as it had previously. It was now quote-unquote win at all costs, as opposed to winning through demonstrating skill. However, this did not mean Baton Pass wasn't considered pure cheese. Of course it was. Nothing had fundamentally changed about it. If anything, it was becoming alarmingly consistent with further optimizations, meaning its inherently limited counterplay just became more and more limited. So with this in mind, Baton Pass was brought up as a suspect in multiple generations. All good, right? It only brought negatives by making the game less competitive through how it decreased emphasis on player skill and increased issues of matchup. This is exactly what the suspect test system is for, right? Well, as it turned out, much of the player base loved complaining about BP, how unfair it was for them to get cheesed by it in a tournament battle, how unskilled it was and whatnot, but for reasons unknown to us even now, general contrarianism, maybe. When it came time to actually potentially ban it, these same players were singing a different tune. Part of it was the general opposition to banning a move as opposed to banning a Pokemon. But this soon dissipated into just the idea of quote-unquote BP is fine because it doesn't actually beat everything, which is the same kind of logic used to justify Genesect not being broken because it's not as bad as Groudon. Nowadays, BP's unbalanced nature is the most self-evident of foregone conclusions, but a decade or so ago, convincing your average player it was a problem was like pulling teeth. Many an argument was made for the positives of such a tactic being present in the metagame actually, because it keeps team building honest, despite the directly anti-competitive nature of its overly restrictive counter options at the heart of BP. Putting aside the mysterious motivations for defending the playstyle that continue to baffle baffle us today, it took oceans of effort across several attempts to get BP neutered at all, and then when it proved problematic even in its neutered form, to have it removed outright. Of course, once BP was removed, nobody missed it for a second. In fact, everyone is thrilled to not have to deal with it anymore. Nobody is defending BP in retrospect. However, to get to this point, many generations of players had to wade through a tidal wave of outrage that this move that didn't even do damage was getting banned. The three Pokemon mentioned here are well known for how outstandingly broken they were in their respective metagames. There are some bans that are close calls that could have gone either way. Think something like Gen 4 Salamence, Gen 6 Hoopa Unbound, the kind of Pokemon that you'll occasionally see someone ask, was it really as bad as all that? Garchomp, Blaziken, and Gen 6 Aegislash are decidedly not that. Very much the opposite. They are all bemoaned as incredibly busted. Nobody good is campaigning to bring them back. However, when they were first up on the chopping block, they were met with gales of protest in spite of their overwhelming power. We have grouped them together because they fall under the common umbrella of what is referred to by the experienced player base as new toy syndrome. Garchomp and Aegislash had just been introduced in their respective generations. Blaziken was of course not new in Gen 5, but the addition of speed boost on it had made it practically an entirely new Pokemon. Moreover, these Pokemon were all proposed to be banned relatively early in their respective generations, understandably given their brokenness. Garchomp was banned before Platinum even came out. Blaziken was banned early in Black and White 1, and Aegislash was banned in X and Y, sometime before the release of ORAS. It is also understandable then that a significant portion of the player base that enjoyed using them due to their effectiveness was reluctant to see them as sufficiently broken as deserving of ban. The toy was still new, and they weren't ready to give it up yet, as many of them would later admit. There was significantly less pushback against various other bans like Thundurus Incarnate and Excadrill, because by the time they were on the chopping block, the metagame had been played for long enough to where the allure of the new had worn off. But interestingly, they had been suspects earlier in the generation, and they weren't banned. Despite nothing fundamentally changing about their brokenness between then and their eventual bans, they had to be subjected to the process multiple times. New toy syndrome definitely interfered at first. Garchomp, Blaziken, and Aegislash were so overpowered, they were banned in spite of the outcry against them, which is why they were so controversial. There were other factors contributing to each of their bans beyond new toy syndrome, of course. The suspect test process was still new at the time of Garchomp's ban, so there were two anti-ban groups: the advanced era players who would rather just deal with it since they preferred to not ban anything weaker than Kyogre, and the new players, many of which had attachment to Garchomp due to its pseudo-legendary status that made it one of the faces of the 4th gen, especially as it was Champion Cynthia's strongest Pokemon. Blaziken was the first ever starter Pokemon to get banned from OU, which of course caused a storm of outrage from massive throngs of casual fans who wanted to use their in-game favorites in standard play. And Aegislash, well, perhaps due to the rather unprecedented nature of its playstyle, there was a significant portion of the player base which genuinely believed dealing with the 50/50s Aegislash caused through its tier warping King Shield was a matter of skill. The much joked about phrase, quote-unquote, outplay the coin flip, was originally said in complete seriousness, to say nothing of the weighted aspect of the 50/50, where Aegislash could almost always just play it safe and be fine. Many players went on crusades explaining to those less experienced how this was actually a very bad thing to have around. Aegislash's popularity was such that it actually got retested in ORAS, which many considered a huge wasteful mistake, though thankfully it didn't lead to anything. Never underestimate the fondness of new toy syndrome. The old school players protesting the culture of banning strong Pokemon from OU in generations 4 and 5 were in for a stunning shock to the system upon the release of ORAS, where even Ubers was no longer safe from this new age ideology. Ubers had been a ban list for so long, not an actively tiered metagame. Yes, people enjoyed playing the ban list because all the crazy broken stuff more or less balanced itself out. Even if there was something particularly strong, usually Kyogre, you would never actually see it get anywhere close to ban. If you were new to the tier and tried bringing it up, you'd be told, hey, you're in Ubers. That's just how it is here. We don't ban things. We just play with the stuff too strong for OU. If you don't like it, play another tier. Since the Ubers metagame, for all its crazy power, always wound up quite balanced, there was never any serious talk of banning even its strongest denizens. There was some Arceus irritation in Gen 5, but nothing overt, and not even whispers of potential action being taken. X and Y saw plenty of complaints about the monstrous Xerneas, but again, no action was taken. The only thing up for debate in Ubers were uncompetitive game elements such as Moody. strategy. But then Oraz arrived and unleashed Mega Rayquaza, a beast that made Xerneas look like a decent pick in UU, and forced the Uber's player base to rethink their entire conception of what the metagame was supposed to be. The idea of tiering Ubers had come up previously, given that it was being played in major tournaments, and an unbalanced metagame shouldn't be in such tours. But since the meta had actually been balanced, the issue was delayed. Now, though, it was urgently thrust to the forefront, not just because of its place in tournaments, but because the Uber's player base themselves were in shambles, as Mega Ray sent everything into disarray. It made every Mega in the tier obsolete, and this was a tier with Mega Salamence and Gengar in it. It packed Deoxys attack offenses, speed that vaulted it past the Lati twins, fantastic bulk for something so dangerous, combined with the fact that it had shed its flying weakness thanks to Delta Stream. All this might have been manageable had it not been for the minor little detail that it was a Mega that could hold an item. This was more outrageous than Kyurem Black's mightiest attack in a fairy type-less metagame. The tier was completely warped around it to degrees absurd even by the Uber tier's highly centralized standards. But still, what was there to do? Ban a Pokemon from Ubers? That was instantly on everyone's mind, yes? But to quote the great Woodchuck Kudchuck Berkowitz, the idea was unprecedented poppycock. This poppycock had no precedent. Where would this banned Pokemon even go? Ubers was the highest tier after all. Everyone scrambled for a solution, and 1 week into Oraz's existence, the Anything Goes tier was created, allowing players who really wanted to use Mega Ray a place to use it. They could even use 6 Mega Ray for all we care. While the Uber's player base would be able to play a competitive metagame once again, the existence of the Anything Goes tier wasn't the controversial part. It was the fact that Mega Ray was banned. Nobody with the Uber tier's competitive interests at heart missed it, of course, but boy was the casual player base furious. Starters banned from OU, and now the coolest, most ultimate legendary banned even from the tier upstairs. Anything Goes placated these players in the long run, but the initial outcry was major. One has to wonder just how extreme a Pokemon would have to be for its ban from Ubers to not be the subject of such discontent. Snowcloak in Gen 4? You mean that tier ruled by permanent sand? Yes, bear with us. The tale doesn't begin with Snowcloak, but its cousin ability Sandveil. With the omnipresence of said permanent sand in Gens 3 through 5 of OU, Sandveil's evasion has been a source of some of the greatest frustration in standard play. Even Cacturne and Gligar eventually got the ability banned from Gen 3. It was first noticed though in Diamond and Pearl Garchomp, which was banned then again in Gen 5. Garchomp was banned for Sandveiling in Black and White 1 and only got unbanned once it received its second ability, Rough Skin. In Black and White 2, even Sandveil itself had been banned, as Gliscor had followed in Garchomp's footsteps and spammed Sandveil to infuriating effect throughout the last stretch of Black and White 1 and was poised to continue in Black and White 2. Sandveil also caused plenty of havoc back in Diamond and Pearl, and there were many attempts to retroactively ban it. After a series of exasperating arguments where experienced players explained to those whose favorite metagame was policy debate that yes, actually, it is bad, game-breaking even, when your 100% accuracy ice or water move misses Gliscor, Sandveil was finally put on the chopping block. So here's where Snowcloak came in. Said policy debaters insisted that if you're going to ban Sandveil, you also need to ban Snowcloak because it's functionally the same ability. This of course missed the part where Snowcloak had never been an actual issue at all in Gen 4. The Abomasnow required to activate it was rare, and if you were using Obama, you didn't want to double up on ice types, especially since the viable Snowcloak Pokemon were Mamoswine, which was also rare, and Frostlass, the rarest of all, whose only use in Diamond and Pearl was as a suicide spikes lead that faded immediately at the beginning of the battle. The odds of Abomasnow and Mamoswine being in the same battle were that minimal, and for that matter, so were the odds of Mamoswine actually being on the field with Hail Love, since Tyranitar was still extremely likely to appear on either side of the field. Even something like Rain Dance Kingdra had a high chance of interfering with the strategy. Nobody was abusing Snowcloak alongside Abomasnow because the odds of actually pulling it off were so minuscule, and nobody running Abomasnow teams was getting unfairly punished by opponents using Mamoswine. However, thanks to the insistence of the policy debaters, Snowcloak was put on the chopping block alongside Sandveil, and both were banned. Now, Mamoswine had another ability, so it was unaffected, oblivious even, but Snowcloak was Frostlass's only ability, and this in effect banned Frostlass from Diamond and Pearl OU, despite having done nothing to merit it and occupying a unique place in the metagame. It died for the sins of Gliscor, who of course continued to be used thanks to its other ability, Hypercutter. This sat in Gen 4 were players who enjoyed Frostlass's little niche as both the fastest spiker and the only spiker immune to rapid spin. It barely affected the metagame, true, but it felt like such a needless loss. However, a few years later, this was rectified. Recognizing Frostlass's unique niche, a new rule was instated. Snowcloak was banned on all Pokemon that had another ability to use. This meant Mamoswine, which had another ability, was not allowed to use Snowcloak. However, since Frostlass only had Snowcloak, it was allowed, and for several years, it popped up sparingly in its Little Spike's lead role. Everyone was happy, and nobody feared Snowcloak abuse. The idea was that if you wanted to make an Abomasnow Frostlass team work in a metagame dominated by Tyranitar and Hippowdon, more power to you. There's a reason why nobody risked it in a serious tournament. And then in 2023, in the wake of the new cheese maxing mentality spreading throughout the player bases of all metagames, a select few players decided that Snowcloak needed revisiting. Initially, the idea was met with great resistance, for the usual reasons that we already stated. It wasn't an actual problem in the sand-heavy metagame, and Frostlass had its nice little niche that would be a shame to lose again. The idea was shut down for a few months until Hail Frostlass Cheese, previously never seen used before by any player of repute, started popping up on the ladder. The Frostlass sets were truly gruesome. One particularly nasty one was Substitute, Protect, Ice Beam, and Mud Slap. To further accentuate the accuracy evasion issue, as a result, Snowcloak got the axe once again, and Frostlass went with it, banned the second time. The controversy began with the fact that the evidence provided for the brokenness stemmed from a couple of low ladder games against opponents of dubious quality, and that the real issue stemmed from paralysis and confusion, like those abused by Jirachi and Machamp. This was not the real issue though. The player base had also accepted that, yes, if cheese exists, people will use it. So it's a good idea to get rid of any potential for Snowcloak nonsense. Nobody would miss that. However, that did not mean that a blanket Snowcloak ban was the only way. A complex ban of Snow Warning and Snowcloak on the same team would remove the issue entirely. Nobody would use Frostlass in order to cheesily punish Abomasnow. Doing so would be a whole new level of unreliable. Abomasnow teams at least had great cheese potential against sandless teams, or if the opposing Tyranitar was worn down, but using Frostlass on the very low chance that the opponent would bring Abomasnow would be an absurd waste. By the way, if you're wondering why Sandstream and Sandvale didn't have the same complex ban, it's because Sandvale was axed in its entirety since there was no meaningful collateral, and Vale only punished the use of one of the most essential Pokemon in the metagame with RNG, which is somewhat akin to your opponent bringing an important Pokemon, meaning you were allowed to use Moody. Anyway, this Hail Cloak complex was pushed for, seeing as it was merely an update on the complex ban previously in place, and there was no downside whatsoever. However, even if it was down to ban Snowcloak or don't ban Snowcloak, most of the player base would have happily allowed Snowcloak to stay in its previous form for the sake of not banning Frostlass. Unlimited Snowcloak Frostlass was clearly not a problem for the metagame. This wasn't an option though, and the second full-on Snowcloak and thus Frostlass ban was handed down from high, a decision which greatly displeases the player base to this day. Here it is, the first complex ban, the original sin that set in motion Generations 5's reputation for disastrous tiering practices that continue to plague the metagame to this day. Gen 5 was set to be all about weather as soon as Drizzle Politoed and Drought Ninetales were announced, to go along with the return of Sandstream mainstays Tyranitar and Hippowdon, along with the new Sand Abuse abilities Sand Rush and Sand Force. Even Abomasnow joined the fray sometimes. Most of the time though, it was Sand versus Rain versus Sun, and as scary as Sun was, it was primarily a battle between the two most consistent weathers, sand and rain. There were many discussions about banning perma weather altogether early on, but even without going that extreme, there were also many discussions about completely banning one permanent weather in particular, rain. The monstrous boost Politoed provided its team were considered overwhelming from day one. Swift Swimmers were the most obvious, of course. Specs Kinger's Hydro Pumps blasted through just about all of OU, 3-hit KOing even Ferrothorn, and you didn't exactly want to switch your weather setter into it. There were many other Swift Swimmers too. Kabutops was similarly ferocious, but the likes of Ludicolo, Amistar, and Gorbis were terrors as well. Of course, Swift Swimmers were just the beginning. There were plenty of already frightening water types that became utterly brutal under rain. Life Orb and Specs Starmie became nearly impossible to switch into, while Dragon Dance Gyarados became newly menacing. Manaphy was pushed to dizzying broken heights. Oh, and it wasn't just water types. The boost to Latios' Surf gave it an easier time smashing through steels. Thundurus, wielding 100% accuracy Thunders, cranked its already terrifying electric stab up to ridiculous levels, while Tornadus' 100% accuracy Hurricane became one of the most spammable attacks around, and those were just offensive boosts too. Defensively, the reduction of Ferrothorn's fire weakness made it even more impossible to take out, while the activation of Tentacruel's Rain Dish made it one of the most immortal Pokemon in the game. With this in mind, the player base was gunning hard to get rid of Drizzle. It was quickly made a suspect and received a simple majority percentage to be banned, meaning if it received another one in the next round of testing, it was gone. However, at this point, Alderon's proposal was made. Alderon, a major tournament and Tyrian community figure, proposed that it would be to the benefit of the metagame if Rain was nerfed without being banned entirely. This would prevent Sand and Sun from getting out of hand and thus limiting the number of bans needed overall. It proposed to do this with the unprecedented complex ban of Drizzle and Swift Swim on the same team. This was not met with universal agreement. Many warned of the danger of going out of one's way to preserve an otherwise broken playstyle, one that very well might be even broken without Swift Swim. Salamence didn't have Draco Meteor banned on it in Gen 4, nor was level 82 Mewtwo allowed in OU, they said. Drizzle shouldn't be any different, and yet the proposal was put in place, and it was there that it was decided that Gen 5 would be the weather generation, no matter how much weather may be screwing things up. Rain abusers were repeatedly targeted for banning. Manaphy, Thundurus Incarnate, Tornadus Therian, and even nowadays players complain about Thundurus Therian, while Keldeo was almost banned twice as well. Rain was preserved above all else, meaning the inherently overwhelming parts of Rain, the Scald turned Hydro Pump, the Hydro Pump's gone berserk, and everything else would always be a part of the metagame, no matter how detested they were. Meanwhile, the original point of the ban, to keep other weathers in check and limit further bans, didn't work. Sand and Sun abusers were banned repeatedly until they were shells of their former selves. If the goal was to keep the ban list minimal, it failed. Gen 5's much maligned reputation as the broken weather generation all began with this complex ban, which set the tone for the rest of it. Its identity was weather, and weather itself would never be banned. Forget the competitive side, it sparked controversy then, and has never really stopped. And that's it. Of course, there are some other solid options we could have included. If we were to return to the subject, we'd definitely look into Shadow Tag, Arena Trap, multi-generational sleep bans, and a more in-depth look at Sandvale, and perhaps even Miraidon and both Zacian forms too. Let us know what you'd like to see, as any ban can be considered controversial, of course. Even Galarian, Darmanitan, and Mega Mawile had their defenders, but in our view, they are the most blatant. Thanks for watching, everyone. And if you want to watch another video about spoken bans, we did do a video a couple years ago on Scarlet Violet's release called the Top 5 Quickest Bans in OU History. It's a really fun video. You should go check it out. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.